There's a small white tub sitting on a shelf in nearly every hardware store and big box retailer in the country. And almost nobody walking past it realizes they're looking at one of the most quietly profitable little scams in the home goods aisle. You buy it for $12 or $15, you set it in your closet or basement, and a few weeks later, it's a soggy mess of liquid that you dump out and replace. Over and over, year after year. By the time you add it up, some households are spending $60, $70, even $90 a year just keeping a closet from smelling like a wet dog. I'm Mason, and on this channel, I like pulling apart the stuff we're all sold without question, figuring out what's actually inside the packaging, what it costs to make versus what we pay for it, and whether there's a smarter way to get the same result. And this one is a doozy, because the active ingredient in those little tubs costs about $4 a bag if you know where to look. And here's the part that almost nobody tells you. It doesn't actually wear out. It can be reused, probably dozens of times, with nothing more than your oven. If that sounds useful to you, go ahead and tap that subscribe button now, because I've got a whole series planned on stuff like this. Things companies sell as disposable that really aren't. Let's get into it. Why moisture is sneakier than you think. Most of us think of dampness as a smell problem. A closet smells musty, a basement smells like a cave, and we figure as long as it's not actively flooding, it's fine. But moisture in the air does real, ongoing damage even when everything looks dry to the eye. Research on indoor air quality has shown that once the relative humidity in an enclosed space climbs above roughly 60%, mold spores that are already floating around, and they're everywhere, in every home, have everything they need to start colonizing surfaces. Not in weeks, in a day or two. That's how fast it can happen in a closed-up gun safe, a sealed storage tote, or a boat cabin that's been shut for the season. And mold is just the headline item. Excess humidity is also why leather boots develop that white bloom of mildew, why steel tools in a shed start showing surface rust within a single damp season, why cardboard boxes in an attic go soft and collapse, and why old books and important papers in a basement develop that brittle, foxed look over time. Wood absorbs moisture and swells, then dries and shrinks. And that cycle is part of why doors stick and trim cracks. None of this requires standing water. It just requires air that's a little too wet, sitting still, for a little too long. The disposable desiccant industry. So the obvious fix is to pull moisture out of the air. For a flooded basement or a chronically damp crawl space, that usually means an electric dehumidifier, a compressor, a fan, a collection tank, something you plug in and run continuously, often costing $200 to $300 up front plus the electricity to run it. And for genuinely wet spaces, that's the right tool. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But for the everyday stuff, a closet, a small unheated storage room, a camper in winter storage, a gun safe, a pantry, a tackle box, running a powered unit is overkill. That's the gap those little tub-style desiccants are designed to fill. And the chemical doing the work inside almost every one of them is calcium chloride. Here's where it gets interesting. Calcium chloride is the same compound used by the truckload to de-ice roads in winter. And it's also used by the food industry as a firming agent to keep pickles crisp. It's produced industrially in massive quantities, which is exactly why it's so cheap in bulk, and exactly why it's strange that a tiny tub of it commands such a premium at retail. The chemistry that makes this work. Calcium chloride belongs to a category chemists call hygroscopic, which is really just a fancy way of saying it's thirsty for water. It pulls moisture vapor directly out of the surrounding air, and it does this far more aggressively than most alternatives. Compare it to the little silica gel packets that come in shoeboxes or beef jerky bags. Those work on the same basic principle, but they're limited. Silica gel typically tops out at absorbing somewhere around a quarter of its own weight in water before it's saturated and done. Calcium chloride keeps going. Under favorable conditions, it can absorb several times its own weight in moisture, continuing to pull water out of the air right up until the crystals dissolve themselves into a puddle of liquid brine. And it does all of this without a motor, a fan, a compressor, or a power cord. No noise, no electric bill, no moving parts to break. It just sits there, working in total silence, slowly drawing the humidity out of whatever enclosed space you put it in, and building your own reusable unit. Here's the part that turns this from buy another tub into build it once and refill it for years. A bag of calcium chloride. Look for the pellet or flake form, not the fine powder. Runs around $4 at most pool supply stores, farm supply stores, or the de-icing aisle of a hardware store in the off-season. To turn that bag into a working dehumidifier, you need 3 things, and you probably already own 2 of them. First, the calcium chloride itself. Second, a bucket, deep bowl, or food-safe pail. Third, and this part matters, something to keep the crystals elevated above the liquid that's eventually going to collect underneath them. Because once the crystals start sitting in their own brine, they stop pulling moisture efficiently. A plastic colander that nests into the top of a bucket works perfectly. If you don't have one that fits, 2 stacked food-safe buckets with drainage holes drilled into the bottom of the upper one does the same job. Either setup lets the liquid drip down and collect separately, while fresh, dry crystals keep doing their work up top. Pour 2 to 3 inches of pellets into the colander or upper bucket. Set the assembly in the space you're trying to dry out, and that's genuinely the entire build. No assembly instructions, no tools beyond maybe a drill if you're going the stacked bucket route. Placement, coverage, and a few practical notes. Now, before you scatter these around your whole house, let's talk about how these actually perform in real space. Because the placement details matter more than people expect. And rather than repeating this for every scenario, let me just lay it all out once. Each unit really only affects the air immediately around it. Think roughly a 3 to 5 foot radius. Unlike a powered dehumidifier with a fan pulling air across a whole room, calcium chloride works on whatever air happens to be near it. So for a single closet or a small enclosed cabinet, 1 unit is plenty. For a larger basement room, you'll get much better results spreading 2 or 3 smaller units along different walls rather than relying on one big one in a corner. Placement surface matters too. The liquid that eventually collects in the bottom bucket is concentrated salt water, and salt water is corrosive. It can pit metal surfaces and leave permanent stains on concrete or wood flooring. Set your bucket on something sacrificial, an old plate, a glass tray, a scrap board, anything you wouldn't mind getting a salt ring on. And one safety note worth taking seriously. Keep these away from kids and pets. Calcium chloride isn't classified as highly toxic, but it's an irritant to skin and especially to eyes, and the concentrated brine that forms is more irritating still. Treat it the way you'd treat any cleaning chemical under your sink. Useful, effective, and kept somewhere it belongs. The regeneration trick nobody puts on the label. This is the part that actually justifies the title of this video, so let's slow down here. After some combination of weeks or months, depending on how damp your space is, the crystals in your colander will have fully transformed. They'll go from solid pellets to a wet, clumpy mess to, eventually, a clear liquid that drips entirely through into the bucket below. At that point, most people assume the product is spent, used up. Time to throw it out and buy more. It isn't spent, it's just saturated. The calcium chloride is all still there. It's simply carrying a lot of water now. And the way you separate the two is the same principle behind every dehydrator and every kiln: heat. Pour the brine, carefully, since it's caustic to skin in concentrated form, into a glass baking dish. Glass specifically, because that same corrosive quality that stains concrete will also slowly eat away at metal bakeware over repeated use. Set your oven to roughly 400 degrees Fahrenheit, somewhere around 200 Celsius, and let the dish sit for 2 to 3 hours. What happens is straightforward. The water evaporates out, and what's left behind in the dish, once it cools, is dry calcium chloride crystals again. Knock them loose, transfer them into a sealed glass jar with a tight-fitting lid. And I mean immediately seal it, because these crystals will start pulling ambient moisture the second they're exposed to air. And you've effectively regenerated your $4 bag. A couple of things worth knowing before you try this. Crack a window or run your range hood while the dish is in the oven, because all that moisture has to go somewhere, and you don't want to just relocate your basement's humidity problem into your kitchen. And don't be tempted to crank the temperature higher to speed things up. Above roughly 400 degrees, you start altering the chemical structure of the salt itself, and it becomes noticeably less effective at absorbing moisture afterward. Slow and steady gets you crystals that work like new. It's worth being honest that this isn't infinite. Each regeneration cycle, you lose a small fraction of the material. Some sticks to the dish, some degrades slightly from the heat, especially if you're in a particularly humid climate where the brine sits longer before you process it. But not infinite, and lasts months to over a year per bag instead of weeks, are very different things, and that difference is the entire point. Where this tool stops, and where a powered unit takes over. I want to be straight with you about the limits here, because building expectations that don't match reality just leads to disappointment, and that's not what this channel is about. This setup handles damp air. It does not handle standing water. If you've got a basement with a foundation crack that's actively letting water in, or a flood situation, no amount of calcium chloride in buckets is going to keep up. That's a job for fixing the water intrusion first, and likely a powered dehumidifier for the heavy lifting afterward. This method shines in enclosed, relatively still air. Closets, gun safes, tackle boxes, campers and boats in off-season storage, pantries, tool drawers, storage units, cabins between visits. Anywhere the door stays shut most of the time. In a large open room with constant airflow, doors opening and closing, people moving through, the slow, steady pull of calcium chloride simply can't keep pace with how quickly that air gets replaced. Think of it less as a replacement for a powered unit and more as a complementary tool. If you've got one space that floods occasionally, a powered dehumidifier can handle the acute problem, and a few of these buckets can maintain dryness in the smaller enclosed spaces around it afterward. They're not competing solutions. They solve different problems at different scales. The bigger picture. Step back for a second and look at the actual economics here. A $4 bag of pellets, a bucket and colander you likely already own, and an hour or two of oven time you're probably already running for dinner anyway. On the other side, there's a genuinely large industry built around selling that same compound in small disposable tubs at 3 to 4 times the raw material cost, with an implicit expectation that you'll throw it out and buy it again next month. I don't think this is some grand conspiracy. Nobody's hiding the chemistry, and calcium chloride's properties are documented in any chemistry reference you'd care to check. It's simply that a business model built on repeat purchases has very little incentive to put "this can be regenerated indefinitely with your oven" on the packaging. Why would they? If you give this a shot, I'd love to hear how it goes for you. What kind of space you're using it in, how long your crystals lasted before their first cycle, and whether you noticed a difference in how the space smells or feels after a few weeks. That kind of real-world feedback genuinely helps other people figure out what to expect in their own homes. And if you found this useful, sharing it with anyone you know who's fighting a musty basement, a stinky boat, or a gun safe full of rust spots would mean a lot. It's exactly the kind of small fix that makes a real difference once someone actually knows about it. Next time, I want to dig into another category of buy it forever products hiding in plain sight at the hardware store. Because once you start looking at things this way, you start noticing it everywhere. Until then, take care of the stuff you've already got.